morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so very much for joining us for this discussion today. We really want to welcome you to today's edition of the ILO's Global Discussion Series, Sustainability in Global Value Chains, Improving Wages and Working Conditions. This is a collaboration with the Mosbacher Institute of Texas A&M University and the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University with ILO USA. I'm Sarah Morgan. I'm the Senior Government Relations Officer for the ILO's Office for the United States, based in Washington, D.C. And we're very excited for our full program of engagement today. I would particularly like to thank Professor Raymond Robertson, the Director of the Mosbacher Institute for Trade and Economics and Public Policy at the Bush School at Texas A&M University, for his moderation of this important discussion. I would also like to thank our other speakers for sharing their expertise: Professor Desiree Leclerc, Ms. Clara Hembold, Ms. Ariana Rosie, and I know that Raymond will introduce them further when he moderates the event. Today's program is going to run approximately 90 minutes, and we'll have 3 segments. The first, opening remarks. Second, a moderated discussion among the speakers, and finally, a Q&A segment at the end. Please feel free throughout the discussion to send your questions in the Q&A function as we move throughout the discussion, and we'll try to address as many as possible during the Q&A. Today's event is going to be recorded, and it will also be available on our website after the event. We're also very pleased that we're broadcasting today's program on the ILO's LinkedIn page, and I warmly welcome all of our new viewers via LinkedIn. At this time, it's my sincere pleasure to give the floor back to Raymond Robertson to start the discussion. So over to you, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for the introduction and the collaboration. It's such an honor for us to be working with the ILO USA office. We are incredibly excited to be working with this panel today for a number of reasons. One of them is that we're dealing with an incredibly important issue, which is sustainability and global value chains. Recently, the Mosbacher Institute at Texas A&M and the Bush School has launched a new program on global value chains where we hope to engage with policymakers, academics, and of course the private sector in order to seek efficient solutions to dealing with sustainability and other issues in global value chains, particularly with a focus on working conditions in developing countries. So to that end, we are reaching out to the ILO USA office, and we put together this event, which brought together 3 of who I think the most amazing professionals in the world, all globally renowned in their own right. And so it's really an honor for me to be able to introduce each of them to you today. I'd like to start by introducing Ms. Desiree Leclerc, who is the Proskauer Employment and Labor Law Assistant Professor at Cornell University School of Industrial Relations in Ithaca, New York, where she teaches international labor law, U.S. labor law, and employment law. Her work focuses on the impact of trade sanctions on workers, new gender rights in trade, and tensions between economic and rights-based international organizations. Before joining the ILR school, she was the Director for Labor Affairs at the USTR, where she negotiated and enforced labor rights commitments in the U.S. trade instruments. Prior to joining the USTR in 2016, she was a legal officer for the ILO in Geneva, Switzerland, where she specialized in maritime labor law and trade agreements. She began her legal career as a staff attorney to the chairman of the National Labor Relations Board in 2006. Next, we'll be hearing from Ms. Clara Hembold, who's working in the global sustainability team for H&M Group Productions and is responsible for their strategy on wages. Clara has been working for the H&M Group for the last 6 years, and beyond her responsibility on wages, she's also responsible for the gender equality strategy. During that year, in the last year, Clara has been leading the work of evaluating the impact of H&M Group's previous wage strategy, as well as putting together their new wage strategy that was launched at the beginning of this year. H&M Group does business with over 700 commercial product suppliers who manufacture products for all H&M Group brands in over 1,600 Tier 1 factories in Asia, Europe, and Africa. While 1.56 million people are employed by suppliers sourcing to the H&M Group. And since 2013, H&M Group has been actively working on improving wages in their supply chain through their fair living wage strategy, which she'll be talking about in just a couple minutes. And last, but certainly not least, is Ms. Ariana Rossi, who's the Senior Research and Policy Specialist for the International Labor Organization International Finance Corporation's Better Work Program, which has been world-renowned for its work in improving working conditions in global value chains. Her work specifically covers policy research, impact assessment, and gender equality with a particular focus on working conditions and labor rights in global value chains and the garment industry. She holds a PhD from the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University in the UK and an MSc from the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK and a degree in economics from the University of Ferrara, Italy. So to open it up, I'm going to first ask Ms. Desiree Leclerc to give her remarks, and then we'll move on to Claire Humboldt and then Ariana Rossi, and then we'll come back to me for a moderated discussion, as Sarah had pointed out. But with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Desiree.
Thanks, Raymond. And before I begin, I'd just like to thank ILO Washington, USA, as well as Mosbacher Institute for this institution or this opportunity to join you guys from the ILR School. This workshop has brought together, many of us who are interested in socially conscious trade, right? We're academics, we're trade negotiators, professionals at international organizations, multinational corporations, and trade unions. Most of us are here today to take stock of how labor rights are treated in the flow of cross-border goods. Taking a step back and critically thinking about these various tools affords us a valuable opportunity to shape an economic and rights framework. The ILO is doing a great work in this area. Various NGOs and even corporations are doing great work in this area. Governments, through their trade agreements, are doing great work in this area. And yet, despite all of this great work, globalization and trade continues to benefit some and not others. And more specifically, for today's purposes, workers around the world are continuing to carry the burden of our wealth. As Raymond mentioned, I'm here to discuss one piece of this very complicated pie, and it's that which concerns labor provisions and trade agreements. I've been working on these issues for several years, although I suspect that there's some in the audience who have me beat. Trade and labor discussions typically center on the various models of labor provisions. US trade agreements refer to the ILO's fundamental labor rights. They're binding and they're subject to sanctions. EU trade agreements refer to ILO conventions. They're binding, but only subject violations to seemingly endless dialogue. The trade and labor system has nevertheless been on autopilot for years. Sure, there are some changes at the margins. USMCA made new protections for migrant workers and against SOGI discrimination. It made it easier to inspect facilities for labor infractions. But it nevertheless follows the same trajectory, which is, to be fair, it's making labor provisions increasingly broad, increasingly enforceable, and increasingly relevant in the trade discourse. As a worker rights advocate, I should like all of that. And yet, after having spent a number of years at the ILO and USTR, I find the trajectory of labor provisions in trade deeply concerning. The reason why is because labor provisions are at an inflection point, but no one is noticing. No one stopped to consider whether the direction of what labor provisions are doing aligns with the direction of what we want labor provisions to do. And as mentioned, when labor provisions go wrong, Americans won't suffer. Those costs are borne by workers in developing countries. I have 3 points to that effect. First, as mentioned, the objectives of labor provisions are changing. In the 90s, labor provisions started off as a policy tool to protect workers and domestic workers and businesses. That is, trade policymakers cared about labor because they didn't want trade partners to flood domestic markets with unfairly cheap products to the disadvantage of domestic interests. Trade agreements concentrated on labor rights that had a demonstrable effect on trade conditions, such as production costs. In order to be subject to sanctions, the government had to demonstrate that labor violations were carried out systematically and in a manner that affected trade. More recently, the objectives of labor provisions and trade agreements have begun to evolve. Policymakers, particularly US Democrats, the EU, and even USTR's Ambassador Tai, have recently been publicly declaring that labor provisions should now also aim to protect foreign workers. Which brings me to my second point. My second point is that while the objectives of labor provisions and trade agreements are evolving to protect foreign workers, the actual content of labor provisions are evolving to potentially punish foreign workers. Labor provisions started off regulating the ILO's 4 fundamental labor rights: Gender advocates are now pushing to include affirmative gender rights protections and quotas. Labor advocates want to introduce new labor provisions that would prescribe other conditions of employment, including wages, occupational safety, and health. As trade agreements become more prescriptive, they inevitably reflect the values of the stronger trade partners. That's how trade negotiations work. As a result, by incorporating all of these prescriptions, trade agreements start to look a lot less like economic instruments incorporating multilateral norms, and they start to look a lot more like the exportation of neoliberal Western values that developing countries have worried about for years. Third, labor provisions are increasingly subject to sanctions. But here's the thing, we don't know what sanctions do to workers in developing countries. We know that sanctions impose costs in trade partner countries. We know that those costs are concentrated in tradable sectors. We can surmise that as those sectors suffer economically, so do their workers who may be displaced as they struggle to find new jobs. We say we're imposing sanctions for the good of workers, who we never check up on after the imposition of sanctions or the withdrawal of trade benefits. On the other hand, and just to conclude, I recognize that if we remove sanctions from labor provisions, we lose the deterrent effect. There's no simple answer to the trade and labor problem, and I'm not advocating for trade and labor divorce or the removal of sanctions. I am advocating for recognition that we are at an inflection point, that we do not know enough about the impact of sanctions on workers in developing countries, and that we are reflexively changing policy to the potential detriment of our objectives and of vulnerable workers. I invite questions or comments on this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Those are very provocative opening remarks, as we would have expected from you, of course, as always. So Clara, we'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Raymond, and also thank you to the ILO and the Mosbacher Institute for hosting this session. And I will be sharing some of the work that we have been doing at H&M when it comes to evaluating our previous wage strategy, which we have been doing during 2020. And we have had help from different researchers, and one of them is Raymond Robertson, but I will also go in and introduce the other ones. And what we have done is that we have looked we will go through what we have found from our previous wage strategy, as well as how we are structuring the new wage strategy for H&M Group. So if we go to the first slide, the researchers that we have been working with when it comes to evaluating the impact that our previous wage strategy have brought is Greg Distelhorst and June Shin. And both of them have been are working professors at the University of Toronto, and they have a lot of experience from working with these topics. Greg have been working a lot in contemporary China and also with other retail brands such as Gap and Nike. And they have a lot of experience that they have been able to bring to the table to us so that we can fully understand the impact that our work have had on wages in our supply chain. If we move to the next. So what I will go through here is basically the impact we have had on wages. When I talk about wages, I will be talking about the average monthly gross wage. And that is what we have been that they have been looking at and the data we have been sharing. And this has been collected since 2011 in our supply chain on factory level for all of our tier 1 suppliers. And what Greg and June have been able to do is that they have been able to isolate the effect of our programs that we have been running in order to understand what wage impact did that have. And if we start by looking at our two biggest, sorry, you can go back one, the two biggest programs, it is the Workplace Dialogue and the Wage Management System. And the Workplace Dialogue is basically a program we've been running within industrial relations, which is a big part of our strategy overall from H&M Group. And it makes sure that there is a proper social dialogue that is functioning, and also that there are worker representatives being there, which is a prerequisite for the Wage Management System program to be rolled out. And hence, that's why we have looked at the effects together. And the Wage Management System program is partly about raising awareness to workers and management about what are the different components of wage, making sure that the workers can understand and read a pay slip and understand what their wages are based upon, but also about creating a certain pay structure in the factories, which I will refer to as wage grids, where basically you match a job description with a skill set and you have a wage connected to it. And what we have seen, or what Greg and June shown, was that this have had a significant impact on the wages by 2.7% increase. And that is isolated only from the effect coming from the program. So it's a real effect, and it is not connected to minimum wage revisions or any other effects coming from any outside effects. And if we go to the next one, yeah, we can see that the effect differs from country to country. So in China and Bangladesh, they had a significant effect on their own, whereas our other production countries didn't. And this can either be because the sample size is very different. In China and Bangladesh, we have most of our sourcing. So that is, of course, contributes to the significant effect. But it could also be due to how well this wage program is fitting in with the national minimum wage structure, or the overall culture around wages, which means that we will be looking at these programs and revise them and making sure that when we have them implemented in countries, we make sure that it fits the national structure of wages and that we are bringing on maximum impact. If we go to the next one, we also have looked at the effect of the wage grid. And I mentioned that before. It's the core of the wage management system, and basically where wages are connected to a certain skill and a role in a factory. And what we have seen here is that where they have implemented this wage grid, which is quite difficult for our suppliers to do, so not all of them have managed yet, but where they've implemented it, wages have gone up to 5%. And that, of course, means that there is a lot more wage increase to come if we make sure that everyone are living up to having this good wage grid implemented. If we go to the next one, we have also looked at trade union presence and that effect that has on wages. And here we have only compared, so we have looked at where there is and where there isn't a trade union present. And what we have seen is on average, wages have gone up by 5.5% in factories that have a presence of a trade union. And as you can see, Turkey, China, and Bangladesh are the countries where it has stood out and been significant on its own, although it varies a lot between these countries as well. And if we go to the final one, which is the efficiency. So we have also looked at, have efficiency or productivity gone up when we have had these programs? And what we have seen is that the efficiency also it has gone up by 3.8%. And that we don't know exactly why this is where this is coming from, but we have seen that these programs have had a positive impact on efficiency, and I will go a little bit back to efficiency later on as well. And if you go and move to the next one, we have also evaluated our purchasing practices. And there we have looked at our supplier relationship status. We had looked at order elasticity, so what we plan versus what we actually place in terms of orders with our suppliers, as well as order volume. And none of these showed a statistically significant impact on wages. However, I have to acknowledge here that we had a lot less data to share here. So we still believe that this is a necessary enabler for wages for suppliers to be able to increase the wages in supply chain. And finally, we did also look at some programs we have been running to improve efficiency and productivity, where we saw that in those factories where efficiency have gone up, wages have also gone up by almost 4%. So if you move to the next slide, I will just quickly run through our new updated wage strategy. So based on this research that we have done, we have now been able to see what is it that is working for us when it comes to improving the wages. And also, we have been working with Raymond and getting a lot of consultancy from him in terms of how we as a retail brand should act, what components are important in order for us to drive up wages. So if we start from the background, you see this white formation, which is industrial relations, and that we still see as a foundation in order for our wages to go up in a sustainable way. In the middle, we have the wage management system, very much based on the fact that it's a corner piece. We have it in the center because of the statistical significant effects that have had on wages, but also because this is one of the components where we can affect. We can decide where we implement this program in our supply chain to a certain extent. In the bottom, we have collective bargaining agreements. This is very much connected to the work we are doing with ACT. And if you look in the right side, you see purchasing practices also there connected to the commitments we have done through ACT. On the left side, you see social protection being connected with minimum wages. And this is new to us. We haven't been working actively with trying to advocate for improved minimum wage structures. And that is something that we will be exploring a lot more going forward. And we have connected it with social protection as we believe that this is, of course, contributing to the overall package and the purchasing power of the workers being able to be increased. And in the top, we have productivity. And as I mentioned before, this is something that we now know have a positive impact on wages on factory level. But we also see that this is a necessarily enabler in order for wage increase to be sustainable for our suppliers. There need to be an increase in productivity in order for that to be able to sustain in a good way for our suppliers as well. So those were the slides that I wanted to go through and just give an introduction of the work that we've been doing. And I would be more than happy to answer to questions about this research and our new wage strategy in the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. Yeah, that was really clear and very helpful. And it also inspired a lot of questions already in the chat. So we're going to be addressing those after our discussion. So thank you for sending those in. And as Sarah points out, you want to make sure you can also use the Q&A feature as well. So thirdly, I'd like to turn over to Ms. Ariana Rossi, who will describe some of the work that is also related to working conditions through the Better Work program.
Thank you, Raymond, and thanks everyone for these great introductory remarks and for just having this conversation. I think it's just so important and relevant, especially at the time that we live in with a lot of uncertainty. And I'm approaching this question really from a labor governance of global value chains and in a way the role that the Better Work program plays in this context with a lot of complexity that has already been explored in the previous opening remarks. I think just a couple of words on Better Work. As some of you may know, it's a program that is a partnership of the ILO and the International Finance Corporation. And the objective of this program is really to improve working conditions in the global garment industry while promoting competitiveness. Two objectives that we see very much interlinked and sustaining each other. It's a program that's been operational in Cambodia since 2001. So we are celebrating our 20-year anniversary this year and has become a global program since 2009. We are now in nine programs across the developing world, really across all geographies. And we cover 2,000 factories and employing more than 2.5 million workers. Now, when I say we cover, what I mean is that intrinsically, I guess, the reason why Better Work is most known and studied, including by many present here, is that it is a unique configuration of the ILO, having interventions really at the workplace level to monitor compliance with the ILO core labor standards and with national law. Something that before Better Work existed was just unheard of. And we've been working in factories all this time, trying to assist them mostly through dialogue between worker and management in identifying priorities to address compliance violations. And by doing that, creating a virtuous circle of dialogue that addresses issues beyond compliance. And importantly, that also supports productivity gains and competitiveness, broadly speaking. We do that by monitoring compliance, setting up bipartite committees that have both worker and management representatives, and also building capacity through training. And this is traditionally the work that we've been doing. But already since a couple of years, I would say, or even longer, it kind of dawned on us that despite the very significant impacts that we were seeing on workers' lives and livelihoods, and even those of their communities and households, our model was just not scalable in its current form, because it is a very resource-intensive program that requires a lot of in-person, in-factory work, therefore a lot of staff in the field, traveling to factories that are often in remote locations. And that model, even though it's very impactful, is not really something that we can hope or even want to scale up to cover thousands and thousands of factories and millions of workers. We really understood in a very deep way that the only way to really reach the most vulnerable workers, including through the different links of the supply chain, was not to just kind of continue churning new better work programs, but rather to empower the global supply chain actors to take the lessons learned from our program and take those learnings into their own operations. This is first and foremost evident in the fact that, of course, being an ILO program, we are built on a tripartite structure. So we very much work with governments, of course, mostly the Ministry of Labor, but often also the Ministry of Trade and Finance, as well as trade unions and worker organizations and employer organizations. And this is a very traditional ILO setting. On top of that, we layer the global value chain actors. And I think this is also quite unique to better work in this landscape. That is, we not only have the tripartite constituents at the national level, but we have global actors that are integral part of the program design. Brands like H&M being the prime example of this, but also global manufacturers and vendors across especially Asia that play a really significant role in the governance of production in the apparel industry. So with that in mind, I thought it's really interesting to see how the program has come to intersect a lot of these other debates we've been hearing so far, including labor provisions in trade agreements, including the role of brands, and something we haven't mentioned yet, but is very much part of the conversation, that is the role of enforcement at the national level, so the role of public policy. Again, traditionally, better work, and Cambodia is the prime example of this, has been built on leveraging trade incentives, which were so prominent in global trade in apparel before 2005, to spur the beginning of an interest in compliance at the workplace level. And even most recently, continue to be really very critical in program design. So we have a program in Egypt, we have a program in Bangladesh, in Haiti. All of these programs are very much built upon a trade agreement or multiple trade agreements that require the implementation or the enforcement or the monitoring of compliance with labor standards. And better work is, in one way or another, in different ways, involved in guaranteeing that compliance does take place. So I think there's definitely a role to be played there. There's another role, very obvious, as also Clara just laid out, just specifically to wages, but broadly speaking about working conditions that global brands can play in being, again, a leverage in the context of a supply chain to communicate basically throughout the supply chain that this type of commitment at the workplace level is a necessary requirement for business to be viable and sustainable in the medium and long term. And finally, at the national level, and again, maybe I'm repeating myself, but it seems pretty obvious from our own perspective that ultimately it is up to the social partners, so worker organizations and employer organizations, to be able to negotiate working conditions, wage levels in particular, but all sorts of workplace conditions in a way that is protected by a national enforcement framework. And it is up to their capacity to be developed so that, in a best case scenario, programs like Better Work should not even exist. And so it's very much in that in that path, which I recognize is not a short-term horizon, but is a path of continuous learning and evolution, that we are positioning the program in the future, trying to really use the unique data and evidence that we are also collecting very much every day at the factory level to inform these discussions that take place at different levels of the supply chain. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really outstanding. It's been such a beacon. The work that you've been doing in particular, and also Better Work, is such a beacon, I think, for so many different stakeholders in the space, that it's great to hear more about. And you've also inspired other comments in the chat, which we'll be getting to. But first, if you don't mind, I'll take my prerogative as the moderator to start with a question for Desiree. And that is, as you mentioned, we're at this inflection point, right, about the trade and labor policies. And the United States administration in February has renewed emphasis on global value chains. And the European Union is pushing. Germany is also making a push for other due diligence laws. So what do you think are the main challenges we're facing at this point in time right now in terms of the government policies and the intersection between trade and labor?
Thanks, Raymond. I think that's a great question, and it kind of brings together the discussion and also the questions in the comments. I'm seeing a lot of questions about well, what about enforcement? How can you believe people? How can you inspect these facilities? And all of this kind of comes together into a head when we're talking about trade policy. So directly, what is the biggest challenge that we're, that from a governance perspective that we're looking at, especially in the United States, is, again, harping back to my initial comments, we need to figure out why we're inflicting this trade policy in the first place. Are we doing this from a purely trade perspective? We want to hold our partners to our trade rules. We're hawks, and we want to, put the hurt on, countries that are going to try to evade our trade rules. Is that what our trade policy is? Because if so, then we're probably fine. Because, sure, we can put, exercise different instruments. Section 307 of the Trade Act comes to mind. And we don't have to give further thoughts onto how the imposition of our trade, sanctions or withholding and releasing various goods at the border impact the broader discourse. But if we are looking at trade instruments and the use of trade policy to advance worker rights, particularly in other countries, then we probably need to stop reacting and start, kind of like what Ariana just mentioned, start reflecting, start drawing lessons from what's happening. Most recently in January, just for example, the United States, through Section 307, exercised its withhold and release orders against cotton coming from Xinjiang, China. And, it's a bit of a predicament, because it's one thing to say we're going to, withhold and release all products made in part or wholly with forced labor from Xinjiang, China. And then it's entirely another thing to say, but we're going to continue operating. We're going to continue somehow making garments. We're going to find a way around this. And to what end? And, how can we eventually resolve this question? How will we ever know that the workers in Xinjiang are not subject to forced labor conditions if all we're doing is requiring some kind of showing at the border? How will we ever trust the Chinese government that it has somehow changed and eradicated its forced labor practices if we don't have some kind of interlocutor on the ground? And how can we ever imagine that those workers are going to have improved working conditions if they have no voice, if there are no trade unions, if there is no worker grievance, if there are no inspectors at these facilities? So when we knee-jerk trade measures, when we decide to make these really, really big trade decisions and we haven't really figured out what our trade objective is, we end up in situations where we don't really have an end in sight, but meanwhile, we're imposing sanctions and potentially costing workers on both sides of the equations some pretty significant jobs.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I'm really excited about the panel today is that the comments that you make about the importance of learning, and Ariana said this too, about trying to just spread out the lessons that we've learned, are so critical for formulating effective policy, right? If you don't understand kind of what the mechanics are, what's going on within the firms, the policies could have very significant unintended consequences, which could be a problem. So that's why I was hoping that, Clara, you could tell us a little bit about, some of the pressure you've been under. Obviously, H&M's always under constant pressure to address these concerns about wages and working conditions. And I'll try not to mention China any more than you'd want me to, because I know it's been kind of come up once or twice for you. But what are some of these things that you've really learned? Like, what do you think? You've done so much focus on this, and what are the things that you know that really seem to work? And then how can we translate those into, as Ariana was saying, right, lessons for other stakeholders, right? What can we take away and share from the things that you've learned?
Thank you. I think that's a really good question, and thank you for not bringing up China too much. We are a lot in the spotlight because I think that H&M has been one of the brands that have gone out and actively talked about wages. And I think that when we started doing that in 2013, we were very bold. And one of the main findings is, as you rightly say, I mean, we cannot do this alone, and the impact that we have is limited. So first of all, I would just like to say that the reason why we have limited impact and we can't just increase the wages is that first of all, we don't own our own factories, so we cannot tell them what to pay out in wages. But also because we're sharing factories with a lot of other retail brands. So if we insist on increased wages, that is something that also all the other brands need to pay for that are sourcing from the same factory. So I think therein lies the main challenge when it comes to factory level. And to address that, I think that one of the things we can do is, of course, that we can try to get the brands together and say that try to share the learnings we have had here from this research. And we now know, thanks to this research, that wages can go up by 5% if we implement these certain wage structures in the factory. So if we can find other brands that want to collaborate, of course, this is something that we can work on. And the same with productivity, we saw that our programs have increased wages. So that is also something that we can work on to increase those. But at the same time, I also think that there is also a limit to how much we can do on factory level and how much that can bring up wages. And I think that although we are really proud about these results, I think that we are also acknowledging that that's not going to take us all the way in how much we would like wages to go up. And there, I think it's really important that we really come together with other brands and say, if we, for example, would like to advocate for increased minimum wages, and I think that that's something that we really like to see, because I think that therein lies a lot of opportunity or potential for increasing wages properly, then we need to come together with other brands in order to do so, because their H&M has a very limited impact otherwise standing alone. And that is what we have been doing, for example, with ACT, where we have joined other brands try to get sectorial level CBAs. But when it comes to minimum wages, we don't have such forums yet. And we are looking at what we can do together with other brands within our industry, but also without and beyond our industry. What can we be doing together? What learnings can we share from, for example, the food industry? So we have recently joined the UN Global Compact, for example, where we can meet brands from other sectors so that we can come together and share learnings from our research, from our side, but from what other brands have been doing and what has been working in other sectors. Because I really think that there is a lot of brands that want to do something, but this is a very complex topic. So we need to share learnings and hold hands to bring impact on this.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I really have been, impressed with the willingness you have to reach out and try and collaborate, right? Because you're being by yourself, you definitely have a limited amount of leverage. So that is really critical. And there's so many stakeholders in this space, and everybody seems to have a role. So that's what I was wondering about, Ariana. I mean, the tripartite nature of better work necessarily brings together all these different stakeholders. But, as you said, we're in the 20th anniversary of Better Factories Cambodia, and obviously more than a decade for several of the other programs. How has the roles of the different stakeholders shifted over time? And, in particular, several people already have brought up this idea of domestic enforcement, and right, the role of domestic labor inspections in the national governments, whether it's in China or wherever. Has that really grown, or do you see more of awareness or willingness, or kind of how has the roles of the different stakeholders shifted over time?
Yes, thank you for that question, and also for the questions in the chat. I think that's really a critical question. And maybe a couple of remarks on that. The first is really just that, of course, we have to situate this discussion in a way political context and the historical context. So if we think of Cambodia in 2001 and the garment industry in Cambodia in 2001, it was basically the nascent step into industrialization for a country that was emerging from decades of civil tragedy, really, and a whole new kind of industrial complex was being set up. And at that stage, the capacity of the national institutions to not only to enforce, but also just to even to regulate labor issues in a context of global value chains was very limited. And I think at that point, and there's a lot written on this, the role of Better Factories Cambodia at that point was much more of a really like a supporting strut to a roof of labor standards. Whereas in recent times, and some countries where we work are perhaps more advanced than others in terms of their path towards this objective, it's clear that it's not a substitution effect in the least, but it is rather better work supporting and building capacity, especially of labor inspectorates, but labor administration as a whole, to be able to perform their function and fulfill the mandates. This is perhaps most evidently when it comes to labor administration when we talk about enforcement, but it also very much applies to worker organizations as well as employers, because again, many of these countries the industry is just brand new, and even having a factory setting is a totally new environment, both for workers and for managers. And it therefore just requires learning. And I think the way that Better Work itself, like our own staff and operations, have seen ourselves in this context has evolved dramatically and has put so much emphasis on sustainability, like sustainability in the sense of we are having impact, but we want this impact to stay and to last and not just be something that is so driven by this still somewhat external intervention that as soon as this intervention is removed, it will just not stick. And I think that's really such a fundamental point of ensuring that the learning is embedded in the way in which these institutions develop and mature and then are able to deal with the issues that we deal with on their own. So yeah, I think that's really the way in which we see the program evolving, and also I guess in this context it's quite important to emphasize that a lot of it has to do really with building an evidence base for what we are advocating. That is not just coming out of course, a very good principled approach, but is actually based on what works and what everybody around the table can really relate to and take on board as something very real and very much based on their experiences and their realities, and therefore much more meaningful.
Well, to dive into that point a little bit more specifically, because I think that is a critical point, the staying power of these reforms and the lessons that we've learned and making sure that they hold on. So one of the things that's very closely related to that, and I know you've thought about this a lot, so I want to give you the opportunity to kind of speak to this, is that there's a tremendous economics literature and human resource literature that shows, especially for developed countries, that treating workers better and having better working conditions and having higher pay and so on actually increases worker loyalty and worker productivity and that sort of thing, right? So there might be kind of this business case. So how much have you kind of struggled or kind of in dealing with governments and even the factories within these countries and trying to present the business case or study the business case, or what have you learned about sort of the efficiency gains and positive firm effects that come from improving these working conditions in the developed countries?
Yes, you're definitely right that we spent a lot of time and thought thinking about this. And I would say that building a business case at the workplace level has been essential in the program's success, in terms really the uptake of the program and the willingness and openness of factories and factory management, especially to engage meaningfully in the program and not just see it as something that they had to do, but something that is indeed really delivering a benefit to all involved. And the evidence we have from Better Work Factories across geographies, across levels of development is very striking and is very evident. Evidence is evident that there is a business case in terms of productivity, first and foremost, as also Clara was mentioning, but also in terms of profits. Now, the catch with the profits is that it is actually something linked to the supply chain. And that's why, again, that's what I was stressing at the very beginning. Better Work, of course, is known for the workplace level intervention, but it is intrinsically a global value chain program. And it becomes very apparent when we talk about the business case, because while productivity gains are very much driven by improved working conditions, whether the gains of that productivity increase are captured by workers and managers or brands or other supply chain actors remains a question. And that can only be resolved by looking at the whole chain. And having that dialogue and having that commitment and partnership with global brands and also global manufacturers ensures that these gains that are taking place at the factory level in terms of productivity also translate into gains that they can make in terms of costing and profits. When it comes to ensuring a longer term relationship with brands, more stable orders, a commitment to improvement and a behavior that doesn't cut and loose when there is a problem. All of these that really reflect a commitment to improvement and to seeing that some changes take time and that we are talking about behaviors that may take years, I think are all instrumental in supporting the fact that there is a business case for improving working conditions, and that it's not just at the workplace level, but it applies really throughout all the segments of the value chain.
Yeah, one of the things I was wondering, Clara, is that Ariana just described that there are these efficiency gains, right? And there are these sort of gains of the factories, and kind of helping people understand that is a critical part to making these types of programs and improvements stick. So that's why I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about some of the, you mentioned in your talk that in your original points that you saw gains in efficiency and that efficiency was going up. Did you see benefits like coming out of what the factories were telling you, that they've noticed these increased efficiency, and how did they responded kind of to the wage strategy at the factory level?
It's a very good question, and I think the answer is that it has varied a bit. I mean, we have seen, as shown from Greg and June's study, that efficiency have gone up where we have had these programs. And when we were discussing that outcome with them, what they were saying was that they have seen that in where there is a better social dialogue, efficiency usually do go up, because then there is an openness in the factory. Workers can talk to the management and say if something isn't working, if they don't feel well, which is contributing to less disruptions in the supply chain. And I think that, so that's one of the things that we have noticed. We also know that some of the suppliers have been very positive to the wage management system and and the productivity systems, saying that it really has had a good benefit for them. The wage management system, for example, is a program that has benefited some countries because it is fitting very well with the structure they have in the minimum wage. For example, Indonesia and Bangladesh. Whereas I know that in Cambodia, this has been more problematic because they have a minimum wage that is set in a very different way, which led to them quite early on saying that this isn't working for us. And that is also very much proven by Greg and June's research. So I think that one thing that is important for us is also to listen into what seemed to be working from the suppliers, but at the same time give them incentive to be working on these things, so that they know that when something is working and when they are seeing when they are really investing in trying to improve, for example, the wage levels, that we are there to back them up. And I think that ring fencing of labor cost is one thing that we are doing, but what we have done recently to try to really show how we are trying to incentivize this is that we have also created a KPI recently for our suppliers where we are actually rewarding them for a real wage increase. So we have been looking at what is the year-on-year increase for every factory. How much did the wages increase compared to last year? And how much did you improve your wages compared to your peers in the same region? So we have looked at this on different region levels, try to be as granular as possible, of course. And we are doing this in our, and to try to, so what we are doing is that we are rewarding suppliers in the way that we are working together if they have paid out higher wages according to these two different KPIs. So we're trying to set up incentivizes for them as well to indicate how much this matters to us and how we are backing them up in their work to increase wages. I hope that answered to your question.
Well, yes. And as an economist, hearing you talk about setting up incentives is music to my ears, right? Because the first day of economics class as a principal is it's like incentives matter. People respond to incentives, right? So it's all about getting the incentives right and setting them up in a meaningful way. So that's why it's really encouraging to hear the description that you just had. And it makes me wonder about trade policy, right? Originally, Ariana said that the Better Factories Cambodia program was set up with these incentives that came from trade policy. How can we use trade policy today to reinforce these incentives, right? So you said there's sanctions and we're kind of beating on countries, is kind of the term Desiree used. But is there a way we could more successfully connect the micro incentives with the macro trade policy?
I mean, I think that's an excellent question and something that I had hoped to raise with Ariana and Clara later on in the discussion. So this kind of invites that segue. As I mentioned, trade policy, at least through our trade agreements, have really centered on the 4 fundamental labor rights. So for those of you unfamiliar, freedom of association, collective bargaining, prohibitions against child labor, forced labor, and non-discrimination on the basis of sex. So apart from those, however, the binding sanctionable provisions have not delved further into the micro. It has set the macro with the idea that the fundamental labor rights, especially freedom of association and collective bargaining, are what we refer to as the enabling rights, that they enable workers to bargain better for those micro conditions. As I mentioned at the outset, there's a move now to become more micro in our prescriptions through trade agreements, to set those minimum wages, to set those regulations, so that this stronger bargaining power, whether it's the EU or the United States, what have you, sets the value and then imposes the value or the micro condition onto the governments. However, drawing from my ILO experience, and Ariana, I invite you to educate me further in this area. I used to work on the minimum wage instruments for the ILO. And, governments used to ask us all the time, well, what should our minimum wage be? Tell us, ILO, so that we can be in compliance with our international commitments. And every time on behalf of the ILO, the response is, well, we can't tell you what the minimum wage is because that would contradict the instrument. The instrument is for minimum wage fixing machinery. You have to do this through a tripartite process. And unless through tripartism, national tripartism, you come up with this value, to impose upon it from the ILO or from the United States or ivory tower actually contradicts this notion of minimum wages in a country. And so from my kind of trade perch, when I'm looking at these really well-intentioned, advocacy efforts, I mean, you can understand, right? Well, tell them the value and then back it up with the leverage of trade sanctions and tell them that you're going to sanction them unless you impose all of these micro values. But these micro values are in contradiction to the very fundamental labor principles that we started off believing in, because we're actually stepping in for the local workers and the local businesses. We're carrying out their tripartite consultations from the perch of a developed government and reflecting on the reason why we have tripartism, why we have dialogue, and why we have these processes. It seems like an inherent contradiction, which is why, again, I urge that we take that step back and we reflect, right? Because as we become more prescriptive, as we become more regulatory into the micro, beyond the macro, we're substituting for workers. We're deciding what's best for those workers. And if that's not the definition of neocolonialism, I don't know what is, but Ariana and the others out there, and to our very knowledgeable audience, I've been watching my friends kind of post questions along the way. I invite clarifications and further information, but this is my impression.
Yeah, no, I think Desiree, you're raising a really fundamental question. I don't know if I can educate it at all, but I mean, I can definitely offer my opinion and my take from where we stand. And I think, to me, it goes back to this question of capacity building and handing over of really the prerogative of regulation and enforcement. And I think in your example of the minimum wage setting, I think it's an excellent example, because indeed, it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where it's like, okay, we may have the technical input, but we are just not in the position of advising just dropping a number out there, because this goes against exactly the principle of enabling rights and negotiation. I think the way that we see it from a Better Work perspective, and it's a very actual, very real question we face, because as Clara was saying, I mean, often in the countries where we work, there is no minimum wage or at least there is no minimum wage that is applicable to the garment industry. So it's a very real life scenario. And I think the way that we see it is that we are there to provide information and data that is reliable and robust enough. And it's not an opinion, but is actually really based on this robust methodology to inform the constituents in their wage negotiation processes. And, there's many ways of doing that, but I think for one example that we have in Better Work is also that goes beyond wages, that Raymond knows very well because he studied it in several occasions, is the transparency policy that Better Work has, in which basically compliance information on a subset of issues, of which compliance to minimum wage is one, is posted publicly on a website with the factory names, and all the details are there. And the intention for that was very much equipping the tripartite partners and beyond with the knowledge that exists and that is not by no means proprietary of Better Work, to have those conversations and define strategies for advocacy, for negotiation. And I think, for me, the bottom line, and I am obviously biased because I'm the researcher within Better Work, I think information and evidence is key in this question. So it's not so much of the technical capacity that the ILO can provide, and also other international actors can provide, is not to provide answers, but is to provide the information and the capacity building that is needed for the actors that have the mandate to actually set policies to do so in an informed way.
And if I can just answer to that as well, because I think that you're bringing up so many really relevant points. And I think from our side, being one of the retail brands, I think that our role in this is also that we can try to incentivize and make sure for certain behaviors, but we also feel like it's very important that we don't become someone that is imposing completely what a factory should be doing. I think it's up to them to also, as you say, to try to have that capacity building, so that it's also done in a more organic way, and so that we have so that it becomes something that is built from the factory, and that they can sustain if we are there, or if we then aren't in that factory, because otherwise what we are afraid of is, of course, that we are building up and we are policing, and the day that we aren't there, this is not something that has been built up in a sustainable way and isn't robust enough to continue. And especially with the other market forces that are there, it's important that we don't come in and be an alien force that at the end of the day is not going to contribute to something good for the overall country. And I also think that what you were saying about transparency and trying to equip the trade unions so that they also can can have this information. I think it's really important. And I think that what we are trying to do with, and what you are doing now with SLCP, and what we are all trying to do to get to this data and try to have a transparency also from a brand perspective of what our supply chain looks like. I also think it's a good way for our consumers to also get educated and understand more about what it looks like and how we are handling our supply chain and our suppliers.
Yeah, one of the questions that's come up in the chat, we've had a lot of questions in the chat, and I'd kind of like to turn over to those a little bit. One of those, I'll kind of go through the Q&A ones first, just because it's the Q&A part, is earlier on, Adam Lee had asked Desiree, and kind of there's some other questions about the knowledge gaps, right? So maybe Ariana, I mean, you said you're in charge of this research, right? So can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the knowledge gaps you still see that are existing, and what kind of research is being taken out to fill those gaps?
Oh, that's a great question that I hardly ever get, and I may talk for hours. I think it's very again, it's very telling. I think of the evolution of the program. Again, that I think a lot of the questions that we currently have, and that I feel also our stakeholders at the national level have, are not so much about dynamics at the workplace level, but are dynamics either at the community and household level, so have to do with more cultural norms in which labor is embedded in, or I have to do with institutional reforms and policy reforms and what's the landscape around those. And so these two are areas where we are putting a lot of effort and a lot of thought effort in developing a research strategy, because really linked to this question of capacity building, one of the issues that, again, will not be surprising to any of you, is that, of course, it's not just about technical skills. It's a lot about challenging pre-existing norms, often to do with gender, with power, with voice. And all of these, despite our best efforts, are behavioral changes that take years. And that measuring the change in individuals is very hard. And it's a challenge, but it's where we generally believe can make a difference and can build an evidence base that is going to be useful across industries and across countries. So that's definitely one aspect. The other aspect is to do with the sustainability agenda and the fact that, and of course, intersects trade policy as well. So it's part of this bigger meso-macro level as well, in which the changes that we are experiencing at the factory floor are embedded into a much more complex web of relationships and of dynamics that have to do with political structures, with history even, with geopolitics between countries, with changes in host countries and home countries, changes in consumer behavior, changes just in the way that the industry is evolving. And this is most evident now due to the COVID-19 crisis and how it's accelerating changes that perhaps existed before, but now are like really at the very top of everyone's agenda, including consolidation of the supply chain and what it means for employment in developing countries, nearshoring, automation. Does it really apply to the apparel industry? And if so, how? All these very big picture questions that hint to the overarching question that really is very dear to my heart, I guess, on how to ensure that jobs in the garment industry can be a Kickstarter for economic and social development in developing countries. And of course, we have all this knowledge showing that if these jobs are decent, then this potential can be fulfilled. But there's a lot of tuning around this statement and these questions that still needs to be resolved. And I think that's a research strategy for a mid to long-term future for us. But it's such a fundamental question that, I think is worthwhile.
Yeah, that's great. And hopefully we'll all be able to collaborate, in this group, right? I want to bring this group
Absolutely.
together.
I can only be so lucky.
Desiree, right? There was also some questions about the impacts of trade sanctions. Do you know of other work that's been done on understanding that better?
So at the ILR school, I'm beginning a project that traces the withdrawal of benefits and sanctions in specific countries vis-a-vis U.S. trade instruments, and specifically it plans to carry out kind of qualitative work to not only look at it, quite often when we're looking at the impact of labor provisions or the impact of sanctions, we talk about it in numbers, right? What happened to the market, what happened to the industry, or sometimes in law, right? What happened in law? Did they ratify the conventions if we're in the EU? But so far, no one, at least that I've seen, and I invite people to direct me to research on this, has said what happened to those workers, right? Who's gone back to see, who's gone back to check in, as I mentioned earlier. So one of the things that I'm planning and beginning now is to actually go back to the workers, see where they displaced, see what their conditions of work are. Quite frequently when I start asking these questions in policy circles right now, what I'm told is, well, they asked for it. It was the workers who invited the complaint or the petition. So kind of, the implicit part of that is like, so who cares? Well, I care. And I think that there are probably a lot of you out there who care. And so what I'd like to do is go back to those workers and ask them, all right, if you knew then what you knew now, would you still bring that petition? Would you still bring that claim? Are you better off now than you were then? And I think that this type of information is critical for us. I mean, again, it's not going to be decisive, right? I don't think that in any event we should get rid of sanctions, but it might start informing a more responsible policy, one that envisions, technical assistance or resources to the workers who were dropped by these trade wars or these trade instruments, vocational training, skills trainings. Ariana mentioned, looking at how garment sector work can lead to bigger and better. But also let's look at what happens when you take away that garment sector work. Does that lead to worse and worse? Does it lead to informality, and why? So that's one critical area of research that's missing. Another one, I've recently put a paper out on this, talks about this movement to include new affirmative gender rights and trade agreements, right? This is a very popular discussion right now, including in the United States. However, if you look at the literature right now, people are very uncomfortable about defining what they mean by gender rights, quite frequently because they're asking for some kind of like affirmative action or quota program in other countries, and they want to link it to sanctions, and nobody can say that yet with a straight face. So I think that we need a lot more information in the gender area about what happens to costs of production when you improve gender rights. And all to say, if gender rights are not improved, if they are unequal, does that provide an unfair competitive advantage in trade partner countries? I think that's a type of economic information we need if we're going to have a discussion about gender rights in trade. So just off the top of my head, those are two critical areas that I think we need to know more about in order to continue to engage in the conversations that are going on right now.
That's great. We had another question in the Q&A from an Aggie, from someone from Texas A&M. I'd like to highlight, send a shout out to Mercedes Lopez, who was asking if Clara could kind of clarify how you verified the CBAs and whether or not they're true CBAs in your work on studying their effects on wages.
That's a very good question, and I wish I had a more interesting answer. But when it comes to looking at the factory level CBAs, we didn't include that in the research that Greg and June did, simply because we didn't have so many CBAs in order for that to be a relevant study to look at. So we couldn't have that included in the study that they were doing. However, because collective bargaining agreements is something that is so important, we will be looking at analyzing all the collective bargaining agreements that we have in our supply chain, using. I know we have been in contact with the ILO and with Better Work in order to get support on frameworks of how we can do that and make sure that we are looking at collective bargaining agreements that are true, that are benefiting the workers properly, that are better than the legal system, but also at the same time trying to educate both trade union members and also the factory on what are in those collective bargaining agreements and how can they be improved. So that is something that we will be looking at. And I know that IDH have been facilitating a lot of great work in Vietnam recently, where there have been an increase in collective bargaining agreements spontaneously without brand involvements coming from employer organizations and trade unions, realizing the benefits of collective bargaining agreements. So what we hope is that if we have a study and really go through what we have on factory level and try to involve the workers and try to take this as an opportunity to educate, we also hope that this is something that the ones that are existing can improve, but also that we can have learnings on what are in those that are working, how did they come to appear, why do some factories seem to have functioning social dialogues where collective bargaining agreements emerge, and how can we take those learnings and implement them in other factories, or implement them even on sectorial level through the work we do with ACT. So that is something that we hope to look into more, and I'm very much looking forward to what will come out of that part of the research.
Yeah, another question that we had was about this broader impact. And Ariana, I think you might see the question in the chat about some of these broader impacts on industrial relations, right? So one question is that if you teach sort of a set of these garment factories, kind of new ways, and they show that productivity is increasing and maybe the factory is more likely to survive, maybe someone's done work on that or something, you might, see other spillover effects, right? I mean, to other factories in the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely what we hope to see. So I think there's two elements of it. One is that, I mean, industrial relations, like sound industrial relations and effective social dialogue are, in our view, really the engine of change, both at the workplace and at the national level, and even at the global level. I mean, it's such a powerful thing when it works that it really is the ingredient that is needed to ensure that there is change that is sustainable. And at the factory level, we have evidence that this dialogue is not just happening by magic, of course, and there are certain conditions that need to be there. And in particular, they have to do with effective representation. So with especially worker representatives being fairly elected and generally, empowered to represent the workforce, and have to do with gender, because in an industry that is dominated by women workers, often trade unions still are very male dominated. And so we found that these dialogue mechanisms at the workplace are only really effective when women workers are represented in a share that is representative of the workforce. So it's a very, I think that learning is something that can be scaled and has a demonstration effect that goes well beyond better work factories. It goes well beyond even countries where better work operates, because it has to do with sharing these very simple, implementation practices of grassroots social dialogue through unions and global union federations in a way that can be very empowering. In terms of how our learnings beyond this one around social dialogue spilling over to other factories in a country or even other industries, again, I think it's really that link of making sure that learnings are being fed into policy discussions. And when I say policy, I don't just mean national policy or public policy. I mean, really like policy and practices of all actors in the supply chain that have, like H&M, like Clara was mentioning, there's this entry point that is very privileged in a way from a brand perspective to be able to share these learnings and making sure that then supply chain actors make them as their own. So not in an imposing way, but rather as making sure that this information is available and is used and is understood and is embedded in the way in which people then think about their role in finding a good, sustainable way of working.
Yeah, one of my great laments as an economist is that we always think we know how everything should work, and then we tell people, and then they don't do what we say that they should do for some reason, right? So we're not great at setting up these incentives, but there is a question in the chat about those incentives, right? So asking Clara if you could describe the details in more detail of those incentives that you might have set up for factories, and then we can kind of go back on this question of incentives and better work as well, right? What incentives seem to work best, and how do we set those?
Yeah, happy to. So I mentioned it briefly in the past that we have built up these incentives. And so basically what we're doing is that we have a program of which if a supplier is performing well on certain areas, and that's beyond sustainability. So how they are performing when it comes to quality and price and lead times, etc. How they are performing there gives them a specific status that could be gold or platinum. And if they do, they are getting certain privileges from us as a brand. And we have the privilege of being a very large brand, which means that we also have a lot of impact on suppliers. And as I mentioned, one of the components is sustainability. And so what we do is that we give a score when we do this annual assessments, and when we do quarterly assessments with our suppliers. We are collecting all of this data on how they are performing on social sustainability overall. And then we are providing them with a score based on that. So having, for example, trade unions or collective bargaining agreements or other systems in place is something that we then generates a higher score. And what we recently have done is that we have then created this score that is connected to or giving them a score connected to wages payout. And that is a very big part of the whole social score for us, because we feel like we really want to reward the impact. We are less inclined of rewarding having a policy in place. We are much more inclined to rewarding have this policy actually led to something. Are there, for example, more female supervisors, rather than just you saying that there is a policy saying against discrimination, for example. And that's why we wanted to have this incentive in place for real wage increase. Is there a wage increase there or not? And as I mentioned before, we are collecting the average wage, and what we do is that we are then comparing if the average monthly gross wage have increased from their previous year compared to what they had the year before, and then are they also paying out more than their peers in the same region. So we're trying to have two different ways of incentivizing in increasing wages, and we have been consulting a lot of experts in order to set this in place, because as I was mentioning previously, it is really important that we are building up these incentives in a good way, so that we are also not disturbing or not incentivizing the wrong thing, because the suppliers are listening to us. We really need to be very have a lot of expertise on our back when we are setting these up, so that it really leads to a positive impact for the workers, and not something that is just on paper.
And Ariana, have you noticed any kind of particularly successful ways that you've been able to shape these incentives?
I mean, I wouldn't say that Better Work shapes incentives itself. I mean, we are there more as a facilitator, but I think it's really by virtue of being a supply chain actor that these incentives emerge, like the ones that Clara just talked about. I mean, it's about really linking it back to how certain aspects related to brand relations, vendor relations, or even trade policy can be leveraged to demonstrate the benefits that can come from this virtuous behavior. So I would say it's more like a facilitator role or a convener role in bringing all of these elements around the table and making sure that they are known, because sometimes it's even just basic lack of knowledge. So that's how I would describe it.
And Desiree?
Sure. I know I've been harping pretty negatively on trade agreements, but suffice it to say, I think that without labor provisions linked with trade agreements, we wouldn't be where we are right now. in the labor discussion with better factories, better work, any of this. I think that because trade policymakers decided to include and recognize labor provisions as a critical part of economic interactions, countries are incentivized to enhance their labor rights. I remember when I was at the ILO, one of the biggest frustrations we had was that governments frequently would not take advantage of the ILO's technical assistance and resources. They just didn't really care. And then the moment they would start negotiating a trade agreement, or they would be included on the DOL's list of, goods made with child labor, what have you, all of a sudden they were really, really interested in the ILO's technical expertise. So you need a driver, you need leverage to incentivize. And I think that trade agreements create a valuable space for that. If you look back at the constitutional and legislative changes in Mexico within the framework of first TPP and then USMCA, if you look at the amazing changes that have been happening in Vietnam on the margins of TPP and even happening today, I think it's fair to say none of that would have taken place without the trade activity. So I think that when we're talking about incentives, trade has perhaps the most critical role in driving governments to see the link between economic improvement and labor rights improvement. I think that we have some areas for, to go where we reconcile what our objectives and the ends and the means, so to speak. But I do think that trade is the most critical component of that. And, from a trade perspective, I appreciate Ariana's work and Clara's work and making sure that this is taken seriously, not only by governments on the ground, which is what Better Work does, but also by the corporations themselves, which are not in the weeds on labor rights. And so this has really been a significant synergy of efforts and initiatives. So I think that we can end things kind of on a positive note, which is that the incentives run through not only from the trade agreements, but then mechanized through Better Work and concretized through H&M efforts, ACT efforts, and the like. So I think all of these are critical parts to a very complicated jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, that's why I could not imagine a better panel today. I'm just so excited and been impressed with the work that all of y'all have done, and as such leading examples of professionalism and outstanding work in the field. It's been such an honor for me to have this opportunity with you today. And I hope, again, that this is just the beginning. We launched the new Global Value Chains program at Texas A&M. We're hoping to do this type of event more often and hopefully host these things in Texas at some time soon. Does anyone have any last thoughts that they'd like to add just real quick? And then we'll turn it back over to Sarah.
No, he's really happy to be part of that, and thank you so much for organizing it.
Yes, likewise. I think this has been a really enriching conversation, and both at the panel level, but also so many comments. So yeah, it's definitely worthwhile thinking of it as a part of a series, and I would love to continue following it. Thank you.
And one just last thing, we've mentioned research and initiatives, and we recognize the wealth of knowledge amongst our panelists. If we've thrown out anything that any of you are working on or interested in, please reach out and talk to us. Let's keep the dialogue going, because this research is collaborative, right? We all have to participate in this to be able to tackle these big global questions. And so it's, while we're the ones speaking today, it could be the rest of you tomorrow, and we'd love to hear about your work as well. So we invite you to share your ideas. And thank you everyone for having us.
Sarah.
Thanks, Raymond. And I think I have the easiest job here. I got to listen to such a rich discussion, and I really appreciate it. So on behalf of ILO USA, I just want to again thank everyone for making the time for this discussion on such a wide range of issues. And please join me in thanking our speakers, Desiree, Ariana, and Clara, for their contributions to the discussion. Also, a very special thanks to you, Raymond, for this excellent moderation of today's event. And to our audience, we hope you found it informative and useful. And we hope that you'll continue to join us for these global discussion series conversations. Our next one is on the 28th of April, which is World Day of Safety and Health at Work. And that discussion will focus on investing in occupational safety and health infrastructure. You can find out more information on ILO USA's website, which is www.ilo.org/Washington. And last but not least, on behalf of me and all of us at ILO USA, thanks once again for joining us. We hope you stay safe and healthy. Have a great day.